Commons Beaumont says, I have said comparatively little in regard to this prehistoric science and weapons, including firearms, although it is manifest that they played the most vital part in ancient power politics. Possession of the knowledge of metallurgy must have been one of the most urgent yet secret objects on the part of those who desire to rule the ancient world. I cannot overstress how vital and important is always the problem of weapons. The science of ancient explosives has never been historicized to my knowledge, yet it lies at the root of most prehistory, for its knowledge and application enabled those who had mastered the secret, so jealously guarded, the innermost of mysteries, to rule over men and to claim godlike attributes. Now, Dr. R.V. Dolphin, after studying in the Libyan desert, studying the glass, Dolphin suggested that for the ancient Phoenicians to have worked with temperatures equivalent to 6,000 degrees Celsius, they must have known the secret of atomic power. 6,000 degrees, of course, is only 2,000 degrees short of the temperature of the sun. And yet here is the good doctor in the Syrian, Libyan desert, studying artifacts, digging up beautiful artifacts, beautiful globes and glassware. The only trouble is, it's been made in furnaces, which is almost atomic energy would need to be used. The temperatures are so extreme. The Smithsonian Institute and the Bureau of Standards in Washington have brought to light various objects that prove that 7,000 years ago, people were producing steel in furnaces at a temperature of 9,000 degrees centigrade. And we have, even from the most junior high, the most elementary level of education, a big question. How come the Iron Age, which is meant to be the earliest age, is the one that comes first? We have the Stone Age, which is the earliest period. We have the Copper Age, we have the Bronze Age, and then we have the Iron Age. So closest to us, our own time, we have the least complicated. It takes a great deal more skill to make copper and bronze than it does to make simple iron. And of course, the argument always put before us is, no, iron was more needed because, of course, it was made into weapons. But that's a side story. That's not what we're asking. We're asking, how come the sophistication precedes? So, meaning as you go further back in time, the skill with ores gets more. Well, it's the same predicament that you have when you go to any indigenous tribe of any culture. They always talk, do they not, of their own ancestors being more sophisticated and more cunning and more artful and even sometimes more spiritual than they. Every culture, they never put themselves first. They never say, we are the smartest ones in our own history. They always talk about their own ancestors being more advanced. Now, why would that be? The mighty flood frees the ship known as the Naglfar, a vessel that the giants were so long in building. Loki steers the ship of hell, and the Fenris wolf is aboard. This is from the Norse Edda again, the Viking mythology. And the ship, the Naglfar, sails out from the east. At its helm, Loki with the children of darkness, the Doombringers, offspring of monsters. Of course, anyone who spent a few days or weeks studying the Viking and Scandinavian mythology, you know that Loki was the dark one. Loki is the god of evil. Well, here we have Loki flying a spaceship, refurbishing an old spaceship with this bestial weapon on board, the Fenris wolf. After the destruction, after the demise of the 4 or 5 great continents, and Celtic mythology talks about lots of other islands as well, as we saw a little bit earlier. But if Fennoscandia, Tyrrhenia, Beringia, Atlantis, Appalachia, Oceania, if Lyonesse and Lachlan and all the ancient islands of Avalon that the ancient books are talking about, if all of these have sank beneath the waves and land is scarce, but you have a certain amount of survivors on both sides, both contingents have survivors, then what happens next is very important to modern history. We can surmise that the original Atlanteans were fewer in number than the progeny they later create. It goes without saying that the visitors may have been fewer than the beings that they later created. So that means that the sons of the serpent, the Lemurians, and their Adamic wards probably were larger in number than the contingents that were on Atlantis. No one knows for sure, but we can gather that this was the case. So, when we follow the histories and the mythologies through, we find that the serpent race, this is the original Atlantean race, they decide, after the pole shift, to now converge at the new equator, specifically Asia Minor and Mesopotamia and Sumeria. And Sumer, by the way, in Celtic means the land of the dragon. So the original serpent race come together, what's left of them, and they decide to vacate wherever they are and regroup at the new equator, because of course this is the only area that would actually sustain life all the year long. So they converge in the area of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Sumeria. The sons of the serpent, that's the Lemurians, together with their Adamic wards, they choose to do the opposite. They disperse to the corners of the earth, and they take their advanced Lemurian culture with them. So the Lemurians, for some reason, decide to do the opposite. And that could be because they realized that those Atlantean warlocks of theirs could still be out there, ready to hunt them down, and that they're very vulnerable. So they make the decision to split up and send contingents to different corners and quadrants of the earth. But here at the Sumerian, Asia Minor, the Middle East, the junction of the Tigris and Euphrates River, this is the area that became the new center of empire, based, of course, on the Atlantean pattern. The word Europe, in Greek mythology, Europa was the daughter of the phoenix, which rose from the flames of destruction. And one doesn't have to be an expert in mythology to understand what this means. Europe is literally the one that has risen from the flames of destruction. Europa, the daughter of the phoenix. Dionysius of Susanna says, they were the first great founders of the world, founders of cities and of mighty states, who showed a path through seas before unknown, and went each wandering tribe far off to share a different soil and climate. Hence arose great diversity, so plainly seen mid nations widely severed. So there we have it, folks. There's the answer. People who've studied these mysteries have long wondered how come the same symbols, the same dances, the same customs, the same artwork, the same performances, the same language, all over the world we find the same shapes and images and iconography. No matter how far you go, from New Zealand to Celtic Ireland, from Celtic Ireland over to the Mexicos, to North America, to China, to the Druids, to the Vikings, to even South America and Africa, we find a continuousness, a same similarity in symbolism and iconography. Well, of course, if it's one group dispersing and bringing the same culture to all parts of the world, could that not explain it? Commons Beaumont again. The ancient civilization of the land we call Egypt has been pronounced by archaeologists as flawless of its type from the very first. It reveals none of the painful steps from primeval beginnings passing through the Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age to that of iron. It apparently burst upon the scene into exotic radiance, its perfected civilization accordingly having been described as a miracle. Science cannot admit any such miracle, and another explanation must be forthcoming. In the book of Deuteronomy, whither shall we go up, our brethren, have discouraged our heart, saying, the people are greater and taller than we, the cities are great and walled up to heaven, and moreover, we have seen the sons of the Anakims there. And of course, we learned earlier that the Anakim is another word for the Nephilim. So here we have in the book of Deuteronomy, eyewitnesses saying, yes, the Anakim are housing themselves in great fortified walls now. They're living behind cities. Sir Leonard Woolley, in his book The of the Chaldees, writes, there is nothing to show to what race the first inhabitants of Mesopotamia belonged. At a date which we cannot fix, people of a new race made their way into the valley, coming whence we do not know. John Keel, in his book Our Haunted Planet, writes, according to the traditions of many isolated peoples, the first great emperors in Asia were god kings who came down from the sky, displayed amazing superhuman abilities, and took over. There was a veritable worldwide epidemic of these god kings between 5000 and 1000 BC. Professor W.B. Emery, in his book Archaic Egypt, writes, "At approximately 3,400 years BC, a great change took place in Egypt, and the country passed rapidly from a state of advanced Neolithic culture to two well-organized monarchies. At the same time, writing appears. Monumental architecture and the arts and crafts developed to an astonishing degree. There appears to be little or no background to these fundamental developments." Now, Dexter Perkins and Patricia Daly write in their book, "Why did a lifestyle that had been so successful for tens of thousands of years give way to one so different? Modern hunting peoples, though living for the most part in marginal areas, are frequently better nourished and always more leisured than their agrarian neighbors. Agrarian peoples not only must work a good deal harder for their sustenance, but are much more precariously balanced in relation to their environment, since they have substantially altered the natural ecology of their surroundings." Diodorus Siculus writes, "The Egyptians themselves claimed that their ancestors were strangers who in very remote times settled on the back of the Nile, bringing with them the civilization of their motherland, the art of writing and a polished language. They had come from the direction of the setting sun and were the most ancient." So Diodorus here is saying that the Egyptians may have been those coming from Lemuria and not Atlantis. The Atlanteans are settling somewhat more north in Sumeria, Babylon, and farther to the east. But the Egyptian paradigm may have been in fact based on the Lemurians who settled there. Charles Berlitz, he speaks of the new calendars. "The Hindu, Egyptian, and Babylonian calendars start or commence a new cycle from the point of 11,500 years to 11,000 years BC, fairly close to the figure given by Plato for the end of Atlantis, or 9,500 years before his time. And is it not from this time that we have not only the rise of the great bloodthirsty empires, but all the later empires that move up into historical times and all the paradigms that we associate with modern city life? It all originates somewhere. It originates from exactly that period of time, from the Atlantean paradigm-based empires coming out of the Middle East. It's from those times that we have the concept of a removed and distant impersonal God. It's from those times that we have the concept of an evil God out there somewhere, or heaven and an afterlife. It's from those times that we have the idea of nature and woman being debased. It's from those times that we have acquired inheritance, or walled cities, when animals are domesticated, and the coming of the meat diet. What we know is the family organization, with a male invariably at the head, and the separatism racially and culturally. We have military strength and warlords as heroes. We have conquest and territorialism. We have the enslavement of foreigners or an overpopulation. And the list goes on and on and on. All of these things that now pester the human race, they have an origin also, and they come out of these times about 11,000 years ago, when the history books and the scholars are only too happy to tell you it all begins then. The whole lot all begins then. And we know that this is simply not true. And James DeMeo, in his fine book Sarah's Razia, says, after 3,300 BCE, divine kingship, the despotic central state, human sacrifice, slavery, polygamy, concubinage, female seclusion, infant cranial deformation, swaddling, and circumcision appeared in Mesopotamia in fully blown institutionalized form. Eric Fromm, in his book Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, he writes, while granting that we do not have much direct knowledge of man's psyche before the beginning of the Neolithic period, there are good reasons to assume that the most primitive men were not characterized by destructiveness or sadism. In fact, the negative qualities that are commonly attributed to the human nature become more powerful and widespread as civilization developed. James DeMeo goes on to say, the enterprise of Columbus, if it occurred today, would without doubt be called a genocide, with accurate comparisons to the atrocities of Hitler or any of the world's most cruel and thuggish brutes. The merciless enslavement, mutilation, torture, and slaughter of just under 1 million island Arawaks at the hands of his followers all within a few short years of his arrival at Hispaniola. The Europeans were not the first to create havoc in the New World, and by the time of the Europeans arrived, very many patristic tribes already existed in North America. Many were already cruel and murderous. Large patristic empires preoccupied with war and human sacrifice and led by blood-drenched god-kings. Influences did come from over the Bering Strait during the years prior to 8000 BC. These earliest migrations were of a peaceful and matristic social character. Patrism simply did not exist in any significant or enduring manner at those times. There is no evidence for it. These early, peaceful people spread out and populated the islands of Oceania and the Americas as well. One can travel through large parts of both North and South America and visit places which are named after peaceful Indian tribes which have altogether vanished from the face of the earth. In the book Against Civilization, with agriculture usually comes the division of labor, increased sexual inequality, and the beginnings of social hierarchy. Priests, kings, and organized impersonal warfare all seem to come together in one package. And David Watson, in his Pathology of Civilization, writes, "Perhaps we will never fully understand the mystery of that original mutation from egalitarian to state society. Certainly, no standard explanations are adequate." There's also a theory abounding in some researchers' minds that the earth in fact suffered such a calamity during these pre-Diluvian periods that in fact it may be dying. Is there credence to this theory? The migration and resettlement of the surviving Atlanteans and Lemurians was compromised by the continuing earth changes. The after effects of the original polar shift and realignment, these changes continue to this day, being prolonged and severe. Aridity, that's the loss of moisture in the atmosphere, is the most conspicuous and devastating after effect. But volcanoes, earthquakes, climatic deviations, erratic weather patterns, loss of topsoil, desiccation, loss of forests and grasslands, oasis, and the shrinking of rivers and wadis all have a major ecological effect. Additionally, with mankind's own proclivity for ecocidal behavior, we can be in little doubt as to the future welfare of the planet Earth. Recent research into the Schumann wave fluctuation patterns suggests that the planet may be slowly dying. Now, the King Djeser from the 3rd dynasty of Egypt, "I am in mourning on my high throne for the vast misfortune, because the Nile flood in my time has not come for 7 years. Light is the grain. There is lack of crops and all kinds of food. Each man has become a thief to his neighbor. They desire to hasten and cannot walk. The child cries, the youth creeps along, and the old man falters. Their souls are bowed down. The council of the great ones in the court is but emptiness. Torn open are the chests of provisions, but instead of contents there is air. Everything is exhausted." D.N. Wadia, in his book The Post-Glacial Desiccation of Central Asia, looks into this problem also. He writes, "In Asia Minor and Syria, which is called the graveyard of 100 cities, in Iraq, which possessed not many centuries the most fertile plains between the Euphrates and the Tigris, the granary of the ancient world, in parts of Iran, India, China, the same sequence of events has happened. Increasing dryness, migration of the indigenous flora and fauna, erosion of the soil, cover by wind and undisciplined rush of water across the fields during the few occasional rainstorms, and the loss of vegetation cover. These ravages of nature have been supplanted by acts of man, his misuse and neglect of soil, overstocking and overgrazing of cattle, deforestation, political turmoil, and the depredations of war." So could this be true? Could it be that Gaia itself is dying? Here are the scholars talking about the post-Diluvian world, all the inhumanity and injustice and cruelty and want of the post-Diluvian empires. E.F. Huntington, in his book Principles of Human Geography, writes, "In all parts of Palestine, unnumbered ruins show that once the population was more dense than now. In Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, the terraces of vineyards, the cisterns of farmhouses, strewn scores of barren hillsides, or are scattered far beyond the limits of modern habitations. Old villages are waterless. Elsewhere, the limestone hills are so devoid of soil that a single farmer, and far less a whole village, could scarcely find land enough to raise crops. So from just a cursory look at some of these accounts, we can see that something is seriously amiss with the health and the welfare of mankind and of the earth in the post-axial shift, in the post-deluge, and in the post-war of the gods, leading up into modern times. Which leads us again to the more specific question of the nature of evil and the origins of evil, because these external events, a war of the gods or the destruction of the earth, what is that doing psychologically to the mind and to the heart of man? He's already in a schizoid situation because of the tampering with his own biology, his own DNA, the fundamental essence of a human being. He now has to deal with the fact that he's part alien in his nature. And this alien, cold-blooded, merciless nature sitting beside his human nature, his symbiotic connection to the earth and to the matrix of the universe. And again, the ancient mythologies have a great deal to say about all of this. In the book of Enoch, the child which is born to you shall survive on the earth, and his sons shall be saved with him. When all mankind who are on the earth die, he shall be safe, and his posterity shall beget on the earth giants, not spiritual, but carnal. Canon George Rawlinson, he speaks of this genetic devolution. They were the boldest mariners, the greatest colonizers who could boast a form of government approaching to constitutionalism, who of all the nations of time stood highest in practical arts and sciences, and into whose lap there flowed an increasing stream of the world's greatest riches, until the day came when they began to care for nothing else, and then the enjoyment of the material comforts and luxuries took the place of the thirst for knowledge. We have Comyns Beaumont talking about the great falling off. For many generations, reports Plato, the people of Atlantis despised everything but virtue, not caring for their present state of life, thinking lightly on the possession of gold. But in time, the divine portion began to fade, and their human nature got the upper hand, having been too often diluted with the mortal admixture. The Atlanteans became unseemingly and base, having lost the fairest of their precious gifts. Now here, Beaumont is phrasing it sort of differently. He is emphasizing the falling off, but as many Christians also think, this is separation from God. We're handed this cartoon idea that because man has distanced himself from the Creator and from God, that is the account. That's the reason for his moral falling off. But could it be something much more intricate than that? Something more elaborate? Not just a simple falling away from spirituality, but actually a schizoid nature within himself. In Lenormant and Chevalier's Ancient History of the East, they write, "In these legends we find traces of a wealthy nation, constructors of great buildings with an advanced civilization analogous to that of Chaldea, professing a religion similar to the Babylonians. A nation, in short, with whom material progress was allied to great moral depravity and obscene rites." Hermes Trismegistus, "So the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches by main force into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds, and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. The pious will be deemed insane, and the impious wise. The madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked man will be esteemed as good." From the Norse Edda, we have the prophetess predicting the falling off of man. In the caption, it says, "Then saw she wade in heavy streams men, foul murderers and perjurers, and them who others' wives seduce to sin. Brothers slay brothers, sisters' children shed each other's blood. Hard is the world, sensual sin grows huge. These are the sword ages, the axe ages, shields are cleft in twain, storm ages, murder ages, till the world falls dead. And in a similar refrain in ancient Ireland, the prophetesses and queens of the Tuatha Dé Danann, after their war with the dark powers, Queen Bave goes up onto the mountain to proclaim the victory. But in doing so, she also offers this prophecy. And I want to emphasize that this prophecy we're about to look at comes 5,000 years BC. Shall we think that the world that she is talking about is the world that we now have inherited? Then she added a prophecy in which she foretold the approaching end of the divine age and the coming of a new one, in which the summers would be flowerless, the cows milkless, and the women shameless, and the men strengthless, in which there would be trees without fruit and seas without fish, when old men would give false judgments and legislators would make unjust laws, when warriors would betray one another and men would be thieves, and there would be no more virtue in the world. From the Vishnu Purana of the ancient Sanskrit people, we read, "There will be contemporary monarchs reigning over the earth, kings of churlish spirit, violent temper, and ever addicted to falsehood and wickedness. They will inflict death on women, children, and cows. They will seize upon the property of their subjects and be intent upon the wives of others. They will be of unlimited power. Their lives will be short, their desires insatiable. People of various countries intermingling with them will follow their example. Wealth and piety will decrease until the world will be wholly depraved. Property alone will confer rank. Wealth will be the only source of devotion. Passion will be the sole bond of union between the sexes. Falsehood will be the only means of success in litigation, and women will be the objects merely of sensual gratification. External types will be the only distinction of the several orders of life. A man, if rich, will be reputed poor. Dishonesty will be the universal means of subsistence. Weakness, the cause of dependence. Menace and presumption will be substituted for learning. Liberality will be devotion, mutual assent, marriage, fine clothes, dignity. He who is the strongest will reign. The people, unable to bear the heavy burden and the load of taxes, will take refuge among the valleys. Thus, in the Kal age, will decay constantly proceed until the human race approaches its annihilation, its prayala. Here we have it, millennia-old prophecies, not talking about the world that they inhabit, but the world that is to come. From the Book of Enoch to the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Skaldic Edda, and the Vedas, and the Celtic myths and legends, all speaking about the end of the divine age and the coming of one in which depravity will be the norm. When we look outside the window today, when we lift the newspaper or turn on the television, these prophecies sound all too pertinent to the world in which we have inherited, and we have to deal with it. But could this world and all of these creations be the actions of the gods that we worship? Instead of falling away from the light and falling away from the gods, could it not be our allegiance to the gods that has actually caused this problem in the first place? Now, evil, of course, is a relative term. Those who prosper from their evil perceive it as good, and see real good as a hampering weakness which needs to be repressed or even expunged. The propensity for immorality and evil, which exists personally and socially, came into being from the Atlantean hybridization process. Perhaps the Lemurians desired in time to reverse the process, but lacked the technological hardware after the pole shift. Perhaps the alien gene was to be conditioned out, made less dominant by the reinforcement of particular ritualistic identifications with nature, the supreme healer and balancer. This process was again, for the most part, thwarted by the advent of the unforeseen earth changes. And the net result is that the post-diluvian humanity is left with the consequences of their schizophrenia, with each person condemned like Hamlets to deal with their moral dilemmas as best they can. As Nobel laureate Konrad Lorenz said, man is the missing link between the apes and human beings. It's like Mahatma Gandhi, when asked about civilization, he said, yes, it would be a good idea. And the great scientist and humanitarian Wilhelm Reich said, civilization, we have never had it yet. And as we saw earlier, the very word Adam originates from a word Adam in Semitic, which means cut off or divided. Cut off from nature, cut off from himself, and cut off from that which is his true destiny. You can't tinker around with the natural order, and you certainly can't tinker around with the genetics of a human being and have everything be okay. And then if man inwardly, psychically, phrenically is in turmoil, what is likely to be happening to the world that he builds around him? What's likely to happen in the relationships that he cultivates? The great scientist and biologist and student of schizophrenia, Julian Jaynes, according to Jack Barringer, Jaynes claimed that this period, thousands of years ago, was a time of intense psychosis for the emerging human race. And Terence McKenna, in his interview in the Institute of Noetic Science magazine, he says that Jaynes has suggested that human consciousness has changed its character even in historical times. The ego, as we now know it, was not really in existence except under extreme stress. And then it presented itself almost as an exterior intrusion into consciousness, like the voice of a god. Julian Jaynes and R.D. Laing and some of the other scholars who are studying the nature of the human psyche are saying that the ego is a modern thing, a modern creation, and only came about in us because of the trauma which was visited upon us after the pole shift and the subsequent War of the Gods. It was the stabilizing psychic muscle that kept us from completely falling apart, spiritually speaking and mentally speaking. Sigmund Freud had the same idea, but perhaps he was looking at things from the wrong end of the telescope. According to Theodore Roszak, Freud traced the original psychotic trauma to the mythic father of us all, somewhere in the dim prehistoric past. In effect, the archetypal father figure invented the repression of the instincts, first by emasculating his sons, then by becoming the focus of the remorse they felt for venting their murderous rage upon him. That's right, it's one of the earliest theories of Sigmund Freud, the idea of the primal father, the oppressor, that the sons have to rise up to kill, creating primal guilt, the original sin. But perhaps Freud was onto the subject but not got it quite correct. Perhaps it was the father, the Atlantean fathers, that caused the psychosis. And in fact, if we look at our human fears and phobias, it might make more sense to think of them rather as psychological phobias and fears, but that their origin may be physiological. For why is it that we're scared of thunder and lightning, and of darkness and caves and hollow places? We have fear of water, we have fear of heights, of loneliness, of insects and certain other animals, and of enclosed spaces, and even paranoia against foreigners. And it's always put down to us by the psychologists that these are psychological fears, they just came about. So a man's fear of the ocean, that deep fear, that just came about psychologically. What? From a Homo sapien that's meant to have existed on the planet with oceans for perhaps millennia? Why would you have such an irrational fear? But wouldn't you have that fear if you racially encoded into your DNA, encoded into your racial memory, saw the whole earth torn apart, visited by unimaginable ravages, and it was an historical blink of the eye? Such events are written in our genetic memory, and that is the origin of all these fears and phobias. They are physiologically based, not psychological. Terry Kellogg emphasizes the fact that abusive behaviors, whether we direct them towards ourselves or other people or other species, are not natural to human beings. People enact such behaviors because, he says, something unnatural has happened to them. I and they have become deranged. David Watson, in The Pathology of Civilization, writes, "We reproduce catastrophe because we ourselves are traumatized, both as a species and individually beginning at birth. Because we are wounded, we have put up psychic defenses against reality and have become so cut off from direct participation in the multidimensional wilderness in which we are embedded that all we can do is to navigate our way cautiously through the humanly designed day-to-day substitute world of symbols, a world of dollars, minutes, numbers, images, and words that are constantly being manipulated to wring the most possible profit from every conceivable circumstance. The body and spirit both rebel." James DeMeo, in his Sararasia, destructive human aggression and sadism in its worst forms, to include despotism, warfare, ritual murder, and the brutal subjugation of females and children for sexual purposes, are a relatively recent development in human history of less than 6,000 years duration, traceable back in time to Central Asia and Arabia. One of the statements that Plato made about the location of Atlantis was through the Pillars of Hercules. And people thought that that meant, again, something physical. All the literalists took that to mean, yes, the Pillars of Hercules. That is, if you go westward through the Mediterranean, you'll arrive at Spain, and then you'll pass out into the Atlantic Ocean through these Pillars of Hercules. But the writers of old were brilliant storytellers and often wrote in allegory and in fable, using symbolism, rich symbolism. A closer reading of Plato, and we find that the Pillars of Hercules were something quite different than some physical pillars at the gates of the Atlantic Ocean. The Pillars of Hercules are the twin columns. We see a lot of images of the twinning. Here in the Egyptian, we have the two trees that stand either side of the gateway. In great structures like the Taj Mahal, we see the twin columns. Here in the tarot cards, we see the priestess between the two temples of Solomon. And the black and the white pillars always represented the banks of a river, like the banks of the River Nile. Occasionally we see heroes or even the Christ figure situated between two pillars to emphasize symmetry and opposition. Here in the Celtic books, again, we have the saint between two pillars. In Freemasonry, we see also a great deal of emphasis on the two pillars, the pillar of the sun and the pillar of the moon, the pillar of the east and the pillar of the west. And anyone who takes the time to visit a Freemasonic lodge will always see these two columns prominently displayed. In Babylon, we have the strange image of the tree of life between the two hybrid deities. We have the twin serpents of the Maya. And we have the Babylonian chalice of initiation showing the two serpents or the two pythons entwined. These, of course, are representing the two natures of mankind, that man is now a bipolar entity. Young children are wont to remark when seeing the deities of India as to why they all possess these 4 arms. Well, if you have 4 arms, it often implies that you're 2 people in one. 2 people in one would make 4 arms. And we have the left wing and the right wing again of Egypt. Freemasons also have a central figure in the double-headed eagle. One head of the eagle or phoenix facing east and the other facing west. If one studies a swastika, you'll find that it originated with 2 serpents. The Falfot, the original symbol of the swastika, comes from 2 interlaced serpents. And as we saw earlier, mythology is replete with the war or the conflict between man and his hybrid nature, his own lower self. The Old Testament puts it this way, in a passage that relates to the conflict between Jacob and Esau. We read, "In your limbs lie nations twain, rival races from their birth. One the mastery shall gain, the younger o'er the elder reign." But these are not just myths. As Carl Jung in his Approaching the Unconscious writes, the universal hero myth always refers to a powerful man or god-man who vanquishes evil in the form of dragons, serpents, monsters, demons, and so on, and who liberates his people from destruction and death. So the mythologies may often be referring to what appears to be an external conflict, a great hero fighting a dragon, and it can be read like that if you so desire. But we need to also realize that these external portrayals represent the inner conflict, man fighting his own nature, the 2 brothers, the 2 twins, the higher and lower natures, Lucifer and Satan. It's inside. For some of us, it may be nothing more than the conflict over a more petty side of us. Shall we steal? Shall we not steal? Shall we rise over the bones of another individual? Shall we lie? Shall we cheat? And for others, it's a much greater conflict. Joseph Henderson, he writes, in many of these stories, the early weakness of the hero is balanced by the appearance of a strong tutelary figure or guardians who enable him to perform the superhuman tasks that he cannot do unaided. And let's not forget again that with this schism, with this inner conflict, the brain moves into a left hemispherical type of thought, and the feminine is repressed. And when you repress the feminine psychologically, you also do so sociologically. And therefore we have, from 11,000 years on, from the advent of official history, we have the rise of patriarchy and patriotism. Patriarchy arose after the threat of invasion, conquest, and war. Tribes feared being overtaken and decimated, and therefore, out of necessity, strong male leaders began to replace the female matriarchs. This, of course, is the official line. Well, if your world has been in chaos and you can hardly even feed yourselves, let alone build cities and fortify yourself and protect, of course now the balance completely changes. Those who were close to nature, the woman would have been more in the forefront politically, religiously, and socially. But once the earth is in upheaval, and now all you need are the muscular skills in order to be able to secure yourself and your culture, your race, your people, suddenly the masculine abilities, the masculine powers become dominant. P. Stern, in his Prehistoric Europe from Stone Age Man to the Early Greeks, writes, the influence of the mother goddess, who had been all-powerful during the Stone Ages, now began to wane. Male deities, gods of war and conquest, were in the ascendant. James DeMeo remarks on the advent of patriarchy. There is no evidence to suggest that peoples of the more fertile times went about warring with each other, nor did they possess child abuse practices. The female principle was held in high status, or possibly revered. Where rock art was the dominant form, the female is seen to have occupied an equal or even central place in society and was not viewed with anxiety by the artists. Royal tombs, excessive grave wealth, female grave murder, temple architecture, fortifications, weapon technology, and the fully blown nomadism were absent from these early cultures, as were male gods and phallic imagery. In all cases, the arrival of militant armored nomad groups from Central Asia and Arabia initiated cultural transitions which destroyed the male-female and maternal-infant bond and placed all family matters in the hands of the dominant males. The early peaceful people were either exterminated and replaced by the armored newcomers, or they were enslaved, losing their own cultural identity and legal controls over their land, property, and very lives. The once self-regulated, free choice of sexual partner and mate selection was increasingly suppressed and subordinated to the demands of parents, priests, and kings. An emphasis upon military matters occurred with strong men leaders growing in power and veneration, to the point where the masses enthusiastically genuflected to divine kings. In all cases, change towards increasingly stratified political hierarchy and despotism was accompanied by institutionalized changes in family structure towards an increased male dominance over basic life decisions of females and children, an increased control over children by parents of both sexes. Sadistic abuses within the family, in society at large, and in the military appear to have increased in direct proportion to these changes. Polygamy, the harem, veil, general seclusion of females, sexual slavery, male and female genital mutilation, the eunuchism, all developed within the Sarrasian zone as power of dominant males, divine kings, and military castes grew. So we have something very serious happening here to mankind, something that is out of nature, out of context, and something that can only affect us in an extremely negative way. But these, again, utter changes are merely the mirror, the projection of what is happening to an individual within. The original tweaking of our DNA has caused all of this. That, compounded by the earth changes, so severely traumatized the human race that we have the ego replacing the self as the center of consciousness. We have the masculine proclivities becoming dominant. All these atrocities that we see in the so-called modern world can be traced back to an origin. But this origin has been concealed. And the reasons for all of these traumas and horrors of the world has also been concealed. You put religious in front of us and a God, and people stop thinking. We have this phenomena in ancient literature, and we also have modern questions arising as to the reptilians. After the pole shift, the Atlanteans continued a seek and destroy policy against their nemesis, the Lemurians. Despite having scant technological hardware, they also managed to continue some primitive genetic experimentation. The fauna of the Earth was studied, and eventually alien DNA was crossed with that of several species of creature. It was found that the reptile possessed the qualities that the alien masters of Atlantis had desired all along. So after you've failed twice with humanoids, and you know that going back to the drawing boards again is not probably going to work, and you don't even have the technology anymore, you don't have the super technologies and the computers and all the laboratory equipment that you once had. That's all several fathoms beneath these new oceans that have appeared. What do? The ancient legends say that they went back to the drawing boards for the third time, and this time they said, listen, why do we even deal with a humanoid in the first place? That's been nothing but a cause of problems from day one. And there's plenty of other life forms and species on this planet. And perhaps they had done like that on their own planet. So they experimented on all the fauna of the Earth and crossed their alien DNA with many of the species of the fauna, including the reptile. And that is where we have the theory of the reptilians. The reptilians are not from other planets. They do not come from other solar systems and visit the Earth. They're actually made right here on the Earth. All mysteries, all history, all mythology is filled with images of the strange births of the unicorn and the minotaur and the centaur and whatnot. And we have the mythology of the siren coming out of the Greek mythology. Of course, we have the symbolism of the dragon again. But these are dragons who have the gift of speech and the gift of wisdom even. Clement in his apocalyptic fragment writes, "And on earth shall be monsters, a generation of dragons of men, and likewise of serpents." David Fidelier in his Jesus Christ the Son of God writes, "Delphi was also known as Pytho because before the coming of Apollo, the site was haunted by a monstrous serpent or dragon." And from the Babylonian legend of creation, we read that men with bodies of birds of the deserts, human beings with the faces of ravens, these the gods created, and in the earth the gods created for them a dwelling. In the midst of the earth they grew up and became great, and increased in number. This legend is talking about that not only were these beings created, but they were created in laboratories perhaps beneath the earth. And somebody would say, well listen, if there are these reptilians, how come we don't see them walking around today? These individuals, because they also possessed alien DNA, could look quite humanoid, because the original aliens, as we said, were not serpent looking. They were humanoid looking. Ostensibly you could walk past one in the street. And some of the reptilians would have been born like that also. Though they had reptilian DNA, they could look quite human, and some looked very reptilian. So the ones that looked too reptilian, they were phased out or moved into caverns beneath the earth. Some people say they still are there. And that is why even up to the Middle Ages, you always hear about the hero having to go and prove his manhood by knocking on the door of some dragon and do battle or conquest with some hideous monster. So right up and almost until modern times, history confirms that such beings existed. And again, from Babylon, we have architecture, sculptures, bas-reliefs, images, sculptures showing hybrid animals and hybrid creatures. Here on the left is a phoenix-type bird, the Babylonian eagle gods. On the right is a reptilian lizard female with her offspring. We have cave paintings of erect, standing, bipedal lizard-type beings. One of the greatest American scholars in this subject, Professor J.J. Hurtak, says, "In our research, we have come across statuary of very grotesque beings who, according to the Indian and shamanic tradition, went into the earth at the time of a great cataclysm." So from all over the world, we not only have the stories of heroes and gods and great conflicts, but again we have the hybrid being, the hideous monster. We have suppression of facts regarding the skulls and skeletons of these types of beings as slowly it's coming to light. G. Warren Shufelt, a researcher, discovered the underground tunnels beneath Los Angeles, which the Hopi Indians had for centuries believed were inhabited by a lizard race over 5,000 years before. Robert E. Dickoff, in his book Agartha, tells of a Tibetan monk who learned that an alliance of reptilians and human black magicians were causing chaos and destruction in the surface societies by projecting malevolent energy fields into people's minds, using what we call witchcraft, the manipulation of energy. Dickoff says that the monk led 400 warrior monks into the caverns to do battle with this serpent cult. And in Ireland again, the Celtic legends, we have the Fomorian race. This is the earliest prehistoric visitors to Ireland before any of the other races got there. And as we learned earlier, the Fomori means giants, but it also derives from a term meaning those from under the sea. And if you read Celtic mythology, you'll actually come across statements of the Fomori and realize how the gods had to fight them. And there's descriptions of these beings, descriptions of them, descriptions of their king, description of their heroes or so-called warriors. It makes fascinating reading. In the Emerald Tablets of Hermes, we read that only by magic could they be discovered. Only by sound could their faces be seen. But you know, the masters were mighty in magic, able to lift the veil from the face of the serpent, able to send him back to his place. Came they to man and taught him the secret, the word that only man can pronounce. Swift then they lifted the veil from the serpent and cast him forth from the place among men. Yet, be aware, the serpent still liveth in a place that is open, at times to the world. Unseen they walk among thee in places where the rites have been said. Again, as time passes onward, shall they take the semblance of man. Speak I of ancient Atlantis. Speak of the days of the kingdom of shadows. Speak of the coming of the children of shadows. Out of the great deep were they called by the wisdom of the earthman. In the form of man they moved amongst us, but only to sight were they as men. Serpent-headed when the glamour was lifted, crept they into councils, taking form that were like unto men, slaying by their arts the chiefs of the kingdoms, taking their form and ruling over man, to destroy man and rule in his place. Here we have an interesting Mayan picture of a god on the left with some kind of weapon and a shield coming to do combat. But if we study the image on the right-hand side, we will see that it's a large green serpent that has a man in his mouth. There's a large green serpent devouring a human being. If we study this corporate logo from the Italian company Alfa Romeo, we not only find a Knights of Malta or Knights of Columbus, Knights Templar cross on the left, but we find, strikingly, the very same symbol on the right. A green serpent devouring a human being with a crown above the serpent's head. And curiously, Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi has exactly that image in his garden. A large black serpent with a crown devouring a human being. And many corporate logos feature the symbol of the serpent, either in a designer abstract way or in a much more clear way, all throughout the world. In fact, the word Pepsi actually means serpent in Egyptian. In Egyptian, they used to scare their kids by saying, Pepsa will get you, or Apep, and Pepsi was the name of the devil in Egyptian. In this Origins and Oracles series, the program entitled Subversive Use of Sacred Symbolism goes into this in a great deal of depth. And we might ask, who is protecting us from those supposed to be protecting us? Here's the symbol of the Marine Corps with a large green dragon in the motif. And many features, many programs, not only for adults but also for children, and many movies extensively feature the symbol of the lizard or the reptilian. One could do a 5-hour program on that alone. Many involve not only the symbol of the dragon or the serpent, but also of the Masonic pyramid. In the movie Conan the Barbarian with Arnold Schwarzenegger, we actually see one of the heroes or anti-heroes of the show actually turning himself into a lizard. This film is situated clearly in pre-Diluvian times. The whole motif of the movie is to situate it in prehistoric periods. But we find it in much of our modern context, in music. We find the bestial symbols being used in the music business and in the corporate world today. Dick Gregory, the famous comedian, says, "Pay attention to Hollywood movies very carefully, for they normally tell you in a subliminal and occult way what they're going to do." Of course, we noted earlier that the caduceus of Hermes is the worldwide symbol for the medical profession. But here the World Health Organization uses clearly the symbol of the serpent. And in fact, our symbol for money, the American dollar bill, the symbol is this: two parallel lines vertically piercing the letter S. But in fact, that is a very ancient symbol. Here in a table of ancient symbols, we find the dollar sign, or what looks like the dollar sign, but that sign was originally known as a scourge. Now, if you look up the word scourge in a dictionary, it will tell you that it is a whip, or a bond, or a lash for brutalizing and keeping people in order, for keeping slaves in order. The scourge of the worlds. Now, the reptilians that possess and control many of the corrupt world leaders who engage in pedophilia and ritual murder for the same reason. Having access to precise genealogical records, they know who to seek out as victims, those innocent that are of the Lemurian bloodline specifically. This is the answer to much of what lies behind the exposés of Kathy O'Brien, Arizona Wilder, Bryce Taylor, and others who have come forth to reveal what they have seen and experienced behind the corridors of power. The hybrid reptilians were created to seek out and destroy the Lemurians on behalf of their alien masters. This was like their day job. This process has not ceased in ancient times, but still goes on today. Now we come full circle to examine what has happened more distinctly in our own times. We don't have time in one presentation or even in a series of presentations to delineate and examine every single machination of these entities in the last 11,000 years. But we can look at a few that are specific to our own times. Now, when the pursuers of the Nephilim destroyed the planet Tiamat, they made haste to leave our solar system to avoid the cosmic upheavals created by their action. However, for some reason, they took extraordinary precautions to prevent their enemies, should they be still alive on our planet, from ever leaving. They erected a powerful energy barrier around our entire planet. This enveloping shield still exists, and no one on Earth can physically break through or go beyond it. Now, earlier we saw that the Nephilim arrived on our planet not by their own free will. They arrived here approximately 50,000 years ago, and the subsequent pole shift and the War of the Gods occurred about 13,005 years from our present age. Now, the Nephilim arrived in our solar system after being expurged from their own planetary systems, wherever those may be. I tend to think that that was Draco, the constellation of Draco, or Alpha Draconis perhaps. They arrived here not of their own free will, and the pursuers, after destroying Tiamat, had to make haste to leave, because we don't drive our car through an earthquake by choice, do we? But before they left, they erected a membrane and etheric barrier around our Earth just as a quarantine measure, in order to make sure that just in case the Nephilim, their hated nemesis, were on this planet, that they could never again leave to spread their evil elsewhere in the galaxy or the universe. That barrier is the true Stargate. So when we hear about that term, the Stargate, we should realize that it also has historical precedence. And it's up there. A shield or a barrier around the earth. And the mythologies talk about it. The ancient scriptures talk about this barrier around the earth. It's part technology, but it's also part etheric energy, far in advance of our own science today. In the Pistis Sophia, one of the most ancient Gnostic texts, it says, "The outer darkness is a huge dragon whose tail is in its mouth." And that was the symbol that has come down to us from mythology to illustrate this particular encircling field of energy, the serpent with a tail in its own mouth, which is called the Ouroboros, the encircling dragon. You'll often see symbols of the dragon encompassing a globe or something of great price, like a pearl or a diamond. The Native American Indians have often referred to it as the great web in the sky. And we might wonder about, again, modern symbolism. And who knows what? Here we have the symbol for the United Nations with the earth with a strange grid and the Roman laurel leaves encircling it. In Revelation 8, we read, "And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key to the bottomless pit." In the epistle of Peter, God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into the chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. So we're hearing in these scriptures that the earth and the internment is described as a bottomless pit in which the Lord has interned the dark ones, that the beings can enter into our earth atmosphere or through the membrane, but the Nephilim specifically, any entity with the alien DNA simply cannot go beyond this barrier. They're contained here until the time of the judgment. Now, the assassinated researcher and theorist Bill Cooper writes, "No man has ever ascended higher than 300 miles, if that high, above the Earth's surface. No man has ever orbited, landed on, or walked upon the moon in any publicly known space program. If man has ever truly been to the moon, it has been done in secret and with a far different technology. The tremendous radiation encountered by the Van Allen belt, solar radiation, cosmic radiation, temperature control, and many other problems connected with space travel prevent living organisms leaving our atmosphere with our known level of technology. Any intelligent high school student with a basic physics book can prove NASA faked the Apollo moon landings. If you doubt this, please explain how the astronauts walked upon the moon's surface enclosed in a spacesuit in full sunlight, absorbing a minimum of 265 degrees of heat, surrounded by a vacuum." So this piece of controversial information is in fact the truth. You cannot go to the moon. The Stargate is connected with the orbit of the moon, like the moon may be the lodestone or the lock. And the orbit of the moon is in some way connected to what keeps this Stargate active. So you can go to the moon. You could actually go to the moon, but you couldn't go beyond it. And as Bill Cooper is saying here, because of the radiation and our level of technology, it is a fallacy that we've even gone to the moon. Here, from all cultures again, the Ouroboros, the encircling dragon. Always in its clutches, in its protection, is the pearl of great price. Here the artist is actually showing the dragon encircling the world. And of course, again, we have the old mythological motif of the hero slaying the dragon. Now we can understand that in slaying the dragon, there's also a tie-in to leaving the earth, being able to be free to explore the heavens. So in slaying the dragon, it's opening the Stargate. There's a connection now between these two paradigms, carefully disguised in mythology and in folktale, but with an incredible celestial meaning behind it. Now, research has demonstrated that some 30,000 years ago, a highly developed civilization existed in the Andes, and also that the Earth's moon was not there at the time. This supports the evidence which suggests that the moon is not a natural satellite, but an artificial construction parked there some thousands of years ago. That's not as far-fetched as it seems, because of all the planets in our solar system, our moon is vastly bigger. The moons of Saturn and the moons of Uranus or whatever planet are minuscule. They are actually true satellites. Very, very small. Our moon is more like a small planetoid. It's vastly bigger than the other moons of other planets. Michel de Nostradamus, the famous French clairvoyant, says, "He will come to take himself to the corner of Luna, where he will be taken and placed on alien land." Then we have the Lunar Society. Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin. Erasmus Darwin was the founder of the Lunar Society. The group's name owed itself to the fact that the members met monthly at the time of the full moon. The membership boasted such luminaries as John Wilkinson, who made cannons, James Watt, who owed his notoriety to the steam engine, Matthew Boulton, a manufacturer, Joseph Priestley, a chemist, Josiah Wedgwood, who founded the famous pottery business, and Benjamin Franklin, no less. So here we have some of the most illustrious scientists and inventors and politicians, and they all belong to this society known as the Lunar Society and make a point of meeting at the time of the moon. Well, hold on. I thought scientists refute all such occult principles. Virtually all the Royal Society founding members, says Michael Bagent, were Freemasons. One could reasonably argue that the Royal Society itself, at least in its inception, was a Masonic institution. And when we do our homework, we find out that the Lunar Society was the prelude or the predecessor to what later became the Royal Society. The Royal Society grew out of an occult organization. In England, we have the organization known as the Hellfire Club, created by Sir Francis Dashwood, the famous Satanist. But Dashwood was also the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the Government of England. Other members were the son of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Potter, the Earl of Sandwich, who was also a member of the House of the Lords, the Marquis of Bute, who became the Prime Minister of England, Charles Churchill, John Wilkes, and George Bob Doddington, another member of the cabinet. And the Hellfire Club is known satanic enclave. The moon landing of July 20th, 1969, the so-called moon landing. But what is not widely known is that alongside the national flag, Buzz Aldrin also carried a Masonic banner. This has been embroidered especially for his strange journey by the librarian of the Masonic House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. That's right. So here we have the cameras rolling when we have the official flag of the United States being positioned on the moon. But hold on, half an hour before, we've got this whole Masonic ceremony. Well, wait a minute, I thought this was a free country and there's meant to be freedom of the press. How come we weren't privy to that one? How come the moon is even being dedicated to some strange occult fraternity before it's being dedicated to the American people? So whether you believe there was an actual visitation to the moon or the whole thing was staged, either way, even in a staged event, the proclaiming of the moon in a ritualistic way should raise some very serious questions here. And of course, we have the strange phraseology that from beginning to end of the Apollo missions, we have this strange, bizarre phraseology which NASA has never satisfactorily explained. One of the most obvious and most heard euphemisms, of course, is the eagle has landed. And everyone associated that with the eagle symbol of America. But in fact, the eagle is a Masonic symbol because it is really, what is being referred to is really the double eagle of Freemasonry and not the bald eagle of America. The double eagle is a very famous symbol of Freemasonry. It was originally the emblem of the Habsburg dynasty of Europe, a very powerful set of oligarchs and royalty that still exist and are responsible for innumerable wars and dynastic rivalries. Now in the Quran, chapter 9:11 no less, it says, "For it is written that a son of Arabia would awaken a fearsome eagle. The wrath of the eagle would be felt throughout the lands of Allah." Now, as I said earlier, we have not got the time to deal with all the sundry historical machinations from the last 11,000 years. But one particular period, one particular epoch that should concern us is what we know today historically as the Renaissance. About the time of the 15th century, as they were congratulating themselves on their progress, the alien bureaucracy discovered the presence of the Stargate. They had to face the fact that even if all their technological hardware was successfully reconstructed, they still could not vacate the planet Earth, which had been placed under quarantine. So here we have it. Hundreds, thousands of years are going by. The alien progeny have understood that yes, all the technological hardware that they once had created and had brought here to the planet Earth, which may have even included spacecrafts and all sorts of cybernetic technologically advanced devices, all of it, or a good deal of it, has been destroyed. So here they are, spending 11,000 years moving mankind gradually, manipulating every phase of history, putting whole nations under the swords, stretching their empire out to encompass the whole of the globe, mining and enslaving the whole human race in order to slowly, incrementally push the technology further to the point where they can restore some of this. And that accounts for why in the world for 11,000 years we've been so sexually and genetically and genderally and emotionally and psychologically arrested while we're so super technologically advanced. But they've realized after they discover the Stargate that now, even if they manage to succeed in phase one, the Stargate exists. They're in quarantine. Perhaps they'll never be able to leave after all. And they probably found this out the hard way. A very huge and puzzling meteorite fell thunderously in Soviet Siberia on July 30th, 1908. Peasants heard the awesome explosion as far as 620 miles away. A large area of forest was flattened as if an immense object had fallen. No remnants of the alleged meteorite could be found anywhere underground. Radioactivity had initially been released in enormous amounts. The general destruction showed that the energy released had been far greater than the mere impact of a falling stone, no matter how huge. Most significantly, the aerial path of the falling object had not been uniform, but had amazingly changed during descent. Various Soviet scientists then put forward an amazing theory, that it had been a spaceship driven by intelligent beings and loaded with a great power from a nuclear power plant, which had exploded through some accident. Well, if you go along with the theories we're advancing here, we can edit this statement slightly. From the Renaissance, and probably before, through this process of pushing mankind forward, the alien progeny of Atlantis, their descendants of course, probably were able to build some rudimentary spacecrafts. And it was through taking these up into the ionosphere that they discovered the presence of the Stargate. And perhaps crashing right into it, these spaceships would then fall back to Earth in the way just described here. So it's not that we should understand this as spaceships coming into our solar system and then entering into our Earth atmosphere and then mysteriously veering and careering out of control and crashing into the Russian forests. It can hardly be said that those who've got the ability to cross hyperspace would then enter into our planetary space and lose control of their spacecrafts. There's something doesn't sit quite right with that story. More likely, Earth ships are making journeys into the ionosphere in order to penetrate the barrier and can't do so, and then perhaps they lose control and fall back to Earth. But undaunted by this discovery, the alien progeny decide to press ahead. They put their greatest intellectuals onto the problem to see if a solution could be found, believing that what technology could erect, technology could take down. The major dynasties of the planet underwrote occultists, scholars, scientists, and philosophers to work on the Stargate problem. Elaborate efforts were also made to cover up the existence of the real opus. The perfect covers came to be that of both science and occultism. It was so effective that even today, most students and practitioners of both science and magic are unaware of the practical importance of their work and to whom it is really of benefit. Those of the inner sanctums also adopt clever cover acts and stories in order to be able to work undetected. Fronts are utilized by all major criminal syndicates, and it is no different with the children of the Nephilim, who have a great deal to hide from public view. And at this point we should remark that, of course, when we talk about the Atlantean progeny, we're not talking about the originals. These beings from other worlds with a pure alien DNA, and perhaps even some of their progeny, those with human and alien DNA, live for extended periods of time. There's reports that the original alien warlocks could live for up to 700 years, but they are not eternal and do in fact die. So the Atlantean progeny, the bloodline that we're talking about, are descendants of the original warlocks of Atlantis. We can surmise that none of the original warlocks exist, although some accounts say that they do. So who are the new Atlanteans? And how would we identify them? Well, we've got strange personalities all over history. Open any history book and faces stare out of you. Machiavelli, Nostradamus, all these bizarre creatures and characters and the dramatis personae of history. Interestingly, here we have a picture of Rasputin, the Russian warlock. Well, the word Grigori means in Greek the fallen one or the fallen angel. And of course, Rasputin was the devil responsible for the destruction of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. But we can speculate that the great kings have the alien blood, and perhaps even some of the popes. And it's not so far-fetched when you start reading some of their biographies and penchants for slaughter and abuse. We have in English mythology William the Conqueror, of course, the Norman king who brought such destruction and mayhem to England. In fact, so bad it was that the people of England referred to his reign as Doomsday. This is the term that the Saxon English used for the seizure of their land and the subsequent taxation, which was hitherto relatively unknown. William the Conqueror brought the pyramidical organizational structure to feudal England. But just before he died, and I mean a matter of days before William died, he had this to say: "I have persecuted its native inhabitants beyond all reason. Whether gentle or simple, I have cruelly oppressed them. Many I unjustly disinherited. Innumerable multitudes, especially in the country of York, perished through me by famine or the sword. Having therefore made my way to the throne of that kingdom by so many crimes, I dare not leave it to anyone but God alone, lest after my death worse should happen by my means." And of course, no Irish person on the planet can forget the scorched earth policy of Oliver Cromwell, who literally murdered thousands of Irish people in an all-out blitzkrieg. The 14th century Plantagenet King Richard II, one of the most unpredictable of English kings, after the unsuccessful Peasants' Revolt, he declared this to his Saxon underlings, and these are his own words: "God omnipotent is mustering in his clouds on our behalf armies of pestilence, and they shall strike your children yet unborn and unbegot, that lift your vassal hands against my head and threat the glory of my precious crown. You wretches, detestable on land or sea, you will seek equality with lords and are unworthy to live. Give this message to your colleagues. Rustics you were, and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably harsher. For as long as we live, we will strive to suppress you, and your misery will be an example for posterity. However, we will spare your lives if you remain faithful. Choose now which course you want to follow." This is the refrain of the kings of all of the world. This is the kings, the potentates, the nobles, and the lords. You only have to listen to what they have to say. Now, the most powerful dynasty that enjoyed direct descent from the Atlantean bloodkin was the Tudor dynasty of England. The word Tudor comes from the word tutor, meaning the teachers, that is, the educated ones, those with knowledge. The leader of the Tudor dynasty during this period was called the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth Tudor, Elizabeth I, literally, she who must be obeyed. Here we have that term virgin again also, which one should note. The Virgin Queen. And the symbol of the Tudors was the famous rose, the Tudor rose. And this is why, for instance, there is a rose garden near every government office or government central headquarters. And we have the War of the Roses, of course, in historical terms in England. The father of Elizabeth I was the famous Henry VIII, Henry Tudor. Queen Elizabeth I was put in charge of the problem of the Stargate, and as such she employed several different people. At the head of these individuals, she placed the man on the left who is known as Sir John Dee. And Sir John Dee's helper on this problem was Edward Kelly, the Irish clairvoyant. John Dee, Dr. John Dee, is the creator of Enochian magic. Note that word Enochian because Enoch, of course, is one of the prophets of the Old Testament. But the word Enoch also means the inner eye, or the initiated ones. So Enochian magic is nothing more than the magic of the high ones, the magic of the initiated ones. And through Enochian magic, John Dee believed he could talk to the angels. Now, if we go to the actual book of Enoch, after which the word Enochian comes, the prophet Enoch had this to say in the very opening passage of his book. The words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and the godless are to be removed. And he took up his parable and said, Enoch, a righteous man, whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angel showed me. And from them I heard everything, and from them I understood as I saw, but not for this generation, but for a remote one, which is for to come. So Enoch is prophesying our times again, the days of tribulation. It turns out that this mysterious master astrologer and court official and ambassador, Sir John Dee, was also the head of MI5, the British Secret Service. It's the first secret service that ever existed. The first secret police existed in Tudor England and was created by John Dee. And when John Dee used to go on occasion to visit the royal houses of other countries, and when he'd write back to his mistress, she who must be obeyed, Elizabeth I, he'd always sign at the bottom of his documents 007. That was the sigil of the head of MI5 of those days. Now, of course, that is later picked up in the stories of Ian Fleming, and the reason for that is because Ian Fleming himself was a member in more modern times of the British Secret Service. And what better upon retirement than to write about his own organization? So the 007, the original, way back at the time of the Tudor dynasty, was Sir John Dee, master occultist. And if you study the symbol for MI5, you'll notice that it has a triangular pyramidical shape with the crown of the Queen. And it has an eye, the Enochian eye, at the northern apex. Now, John Dee was one of the most powerful black magicians in history. He decided that it would be better to contact pan-dimensional intelligences to solve their little problem of quarantine. Via his system of magic and divination, he succeeded in opening a portal to these fourth-dimensional entities, or oversouls. Dee became a living macroscope. This was not the first time in history where such a forbidden rite was undertaken, and every time it does occur, it has the severest repercussions from history. So John Dee, being a master occultist and connected throughout the world, he looked into this problem and decided that there wasn't any normal technological or scientific way that they were going to be able to find this key, so to speak, to the Stargate. But he said he could use his occult power. So with Edward Kelly and all the other occultists of Europe, in combination, in concert, they decided to call on what are known in the occult world as pan-dimensional oversouls, beings that are above our level of consciousness. Not necessarily more pure or more spiritual, but of a higher spiritual intelligence, let's say. The oversouls. Later writers have called these entities the macrobes. This word comes from the fact that there are beings, creatures, entities below us who are called the microbes, and it takes a microscope to see them. Before the advent of the microscope, if anyone had told you that there's all sorts of little creatures and little entities, but you just can't see them, we would have thought they were crazy and probably burned them at the stake as being heretics. But as soon as we have the right instrument, we look through it and we're able to see a whole world, a whole ecostructure of microbes and bacteria and viruses and whatnot. Well, above the level of the human consciousness are the macrobes. And as yet, there's no instrument per se in order to see it. But there is an instrument, and that instrument is known as the human intuition. It's through the human intuition, the human imagination, that one can make contact with the macrobes. John Dee did make contact with the macrobes. In fact, he became what might be described as a living macroscope. Now, in short, Dee was told that there were two cardinal premises which needed to be mastered before the Stargate could be opened. The first precept concerned creating matter from energy, but that would have to be revealed in two main stages. And the second concerned the properties of a certain element, and that element was silicon. Now, phase one concerned creating matter from energy, but as the macrobes instructed John Dee, the human race was way too primitive for that. That phase one would have to be taught to them in two stages. Part one would be to learn how to do the exact reverse, release energy from matter. And then after that, they would be taught how to create matter from energy. And phase one of that was accomplished on July 16th, 1945, at Alamogordo, or the Trinity experiment, when the atomic bomb was released. So the splitting of the atom was phase A of phase one, being able to release energy from matter. Later on, after that period, from the period of 1945, we would start to see experiments which would work on the rest. So MIT, SRI, Hoover Institute, and so on. These organizations are merely fronts for this experimentation, looking at how to now manipulate matter and create it from energy. Phase two was the silicon revolution, the properties of silicon. And of course, we know that silicon is created or is a gateway to the computer age. Silicon makes computing possible. And we're told that technology makes life easier. These are the cover stories that let us buy into some of this stuff. If grandma can do her shopping on the internet, and we could talk over the internet and buy our VCRs, most people are happy and don't think of any of the occult reasons behind the creations of these powerful instruments. Now, one of the greatest New Atlanteans, other than John Dee and Elizabeth I and the Tudors, was Sir Francis Bacon. A Knight Templar, a major occultist, Sir Francis Bacon was appointed Solicitor General and Chief Advisor to the British Crown on June 25, 1607. He conceived the idea of reactivating various secret societies, and in 1580 he founded the secret Rosa Cross Literary Society and the Lodge of Free and Accepted Speculative Masons. Bacon is said to have been introduced to the 33rd degree system into Masonry from the original Templar 9 degrees. So Bacon introduced the 33rd degree system into Freemasonry. For 1 year, he had in his possession the first English translations of the Bible. In fact, he was the first major editor of what would become the King James Bible. He also added secret information into the Bible, which was not there before. And William T. Smedley, who is a biographer of Francis Bacon, said, "It will eventually be proved that the whole structure of the authorized Bible was Francis Bacon's. He was an ardent student, not only of the Bible, but also of early manuscripts." So Francis Bacon was yet another one of the great thinkers and intelligences that was put onto the problem of the Stargate. He was directly working for the Tudor dynasty. In Talisman, by Graham Hancock and Robert Bivall, they write, "Bacon was a passionate exponent of Britain's colonialization and development of its recently acquired North American territory of Virginia. In 1606, the so-called Virginia Company, there's that word again, Virginia Company was granted a royal charter by James I, which allowed it virtually unlimited power of government in the colony. Bacon had been instrumental in the creation of the charter. Bearing this in mind, it is not surprising that in New Atlantis, Bacon refers to Benasalem as the Virgin of the world." That's right. Francis Bacon wrote two very important books that all scientists know. The first one was called The New Atlantis, and the other, The Nouveau Organum, the new organism. The new organism and the new Atlantis. Now, Sir John Dee worked closely with his confederates all over the globe. The information transmitted by the microbes was done cryptically and was voluminous. He realized that many centuries would have to elapse before even the basics could be realized. He also knew how inefficient and counterproductive it was going to be to have separate genius types working in their private garrets all over the planet. The knowledge could not be collated efficiently in this way. So he and his masters devised a scheme to have the scholars come to one place to work and amass the knowledge. These places we know as the universities. And that's right. John Dee realized that it was going to be unproductive to have all these different scholars and occultists and eccentrics and whatnot working in all sorts of corners of the world. Better to bring them all into centralized locations. That's what the word college means. The word college means collage, where many can come together. And of course, there's the silicon connection, now fully understood. We've moved on even from the time of universities. Universities can collate. Yes, they can collate in libraries. You can have papers. You can have documents. But soon even that becomes so voluminous. Even that becomes open and privy. Now you can introduce hierarchies. You can introduce fraternity structures into the university system so that, again, you police people and only the purest can ascend through the ranks to find out what the real agenda is. But even that, in the end, can become a problem. The computer is the miniature university with unlimited data storage space. So here we have a tie-in from the silicon idea and the carbon life forms. Because the internet promises you also worldwide communication. It's a virtual library, an endless space for archival storage. Now another level of information that the microbes had transmitted to John Dee, and what he also realized from his interactions with these supernatural beings, was that in order to even move along with this process, it was going to take hundreds of years. And in fact, from what he was receiving from them, he realized that they would have to subjugate the whole planet in order to not only continue to move the technology forward, but in order to get the element silicon and be able to process it, the whole of the planet would have to be subjugated. And therefore it is from that time, it is from the time of the 15th and 16th and 17th century that we have all the idioms we associate with England. We have the rising of the great navies. We have the rising of empire. We have the rising of the first stock exchanges. And we have the rising of the colonial impulse. A tiny little nothing country, England, where 100 or 200 years before the kings were shivering in windowless castles, literally shivering, couldn't even get the taxes together to fight their neighbors. And suddenly we have empires beginning, empires starting, the great proliferation of what we now know to be the British Empire. And of course, in the vanguard of this were the beings that we know as the pirates, or the pirates, because the word pirates actually means the men of fire. These were direct agents of the Tudor dynasty. The heads of the pirates were the top officials of the pirates. The leaders of most of the pirates were the top brass of the Tudor dynasty, trained in the finest universities, even the fine maritime universities. And one of the greatest leaders of them all was Sir Francis Drake. And of course the word Drake actually means the dragon. San Francisco Bay was originally called Drake's Bay. The pirates, or the pirates, the men of fire, serving the Tudor dynasty, were headed by men like Sir Francis Drake and Edmund Spenser. He was the great-grandfather or the ancestor of Lady Diana Spenser. The progeny of the pirates settled on the lands that they conquered and opened the great universities for the education of their sons and daughters. They employed the fraternity structure to ensure that only the chosen would be exposed to the real occult history of the world and to their role as the future leaders and thinkers, overworld and underworld figures, educated and funded to adroitly lead the rest of mankind down whatever roads became necessary. In the tarot cards, for instance, the devil card is number 15. And we have the old pirate motto, 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. But the occult history of the pirates has really never been told. And of course the famous symbol of the pirates was the skull and crossbones, a symbol known to be used before them by the Knights of Malta and the Knights Templars or other occult fraternities. And the job of the pirates was to bring mayhem and disease and slaughter to all the lands that they colonized. These were agents of the British Crown and not as the Errol Flynn movies of the swashbuckling buccaneers tries to show you some romantic heroes. These people were cutthroats, and they had an agenda to be sent out to all the corners of the world and to massacre whoever they found there. It's important to bring out at this time that the macrobes don't work for free. Though John Dee was successful in contacting them, and though the macrobes did transmit a great deal of information that he desired concerning the quarantine and Stargate problem, they don't work for nothing. And John Dee was soon to find out what it was that they wanted in exchange for their services. What they wanted has had the severest consequences for the future of mankind. The macrobes basically told him that what they wanted was blood. Blood has some very specific occult properties, and that's what the macrobes wanted. And John Dee, his reply was, how much do you want, and when do you want it? Whatever it takes. This thing is already going to take us hundreds of years. Whatever you need for that information, you will get it. And so John Dee literally put the whole of the human race up in a great black magic mass, a great rite to his overlords, the oversouls that were asking him for payment, literally, in blood. Now, blood happens to be the second commonest word in the Bible after God. And Erich Fromm, the scholar, the German scholar, says, at a deep archaic level, blood is very peculiar substance. Quite generally, it has been equated with life and the life force, and is one of the three sacred substances that emanate from the body. The other two are semen and milk. Semen expresses male, while milk expresses female or motherly creativity, and both were considered sacred in many cults and rituals. Blood transcends the difference between the male and the female. In the deepest level of experience, one magically seizes the life force itself by shedding blood. Now, of course, we looked at earlier just how bloodthirsty the Nephilim had already been, and the progeny and the empires that came out of the Middle East. We know, and we've looked at how bloodthirsty and how warlike and rapacious those races and nations have already been. And now we're being put, the whole human race is being put up in a pact to some oversouls. Could that explain some of the calamities that we've endured since John Dee's time? Well, we've had inquisitions old and new. One of the most atrocious human beings ever to be on this planet, Joseph de Maistre, in his St. Petersburg's dialogues, has this to say: all grandeur, power, all subordination to authority rests on the executioner. He is the horror and the bond of human association. Remove this incomprehensible agent from the world, and at that very moment, order gives way to chaos, thrones topple, and society disappears. Lust for the spilling of human blood is a touchstone of the synarchist mindset. Take the 19th century Spanish Catholic counter-revolutionary ideologue Juan Donoso Cortés, who argued that human sacrifice is the most universal of all human institutions. I say, gentlemen, that dictatorship in certain circumstances, such as those in which we find ourselves, for example, is a legitimate form of government. Dictatorship, indeed, is part of the divine order. The meanest reptile, which I would trample under my feet, would seem less despicable to me than man. The point of faith which most oppresses and weighs upon my reason is that of the nobility and dignity of the human species. So let's not say that it's far-fetched that certain individuals walking this planet think of the human being, as Cortés is saying here, lowlier than the humble reptile. And it even causes them great distress to think of the nobility of the human creature. Such is in the minds of the progeny of the warlocks of Atlantis. Cortés goes on to say the culmination of Donoso's philosophical treatise is that the institution of bloody sacrifice is the most universal of all human dogmas and institutions. The most civilized nations and the most savage tribes believe in a pure victim offered as a perfect holocaust, he wrote. Without the death penalty, without the purifying efficacy of blood, all societal bonds would collapse. Since the first day of the first effusion of blood, it has never ceased to flow. and it has never been shed in vain. Mankind has always believed in three things with an unconquerable faith: that the effusion of blood is necessary, that there is a manner of shedding blood which is purifying, and another mode which is condemnatory. History clearly attests these truths,